Okay, so this is a video that walks through the first exercise at the end of chapter 14. On the left, we have the description of the problem. On the right, we have the Access database called Sales Orders, which is downloadable from Canvas. What I've done is I've opened up the tables here so we can see these different tables in the database. Orders table, vendors, customers, products, product vendors, and categories. And what we find is we see some ID fields, but this is not a single table with all the information. This is very much a table that's a database that contains multiple tables that are connected through ID fields. For example, in the product table, we have a product ID, we have a product name, and we have a category ID for that product. So the category of product goes back to the categories table. So the categories is the actual name is not included in the products table. And again, this agrees with the idea of a relational database, where in a single database you have multiple tables and they are connected through these IDs. So let's dive in here to the first problem. Based on the sales orders database, write SQL statements to implement the following queries. Run them in Access to ensure that they work properly. The first one here, find the order date for all orders placed by the customer with customer ID 13. Okay, so we're going to look for the order date for orders placed by the customer. The first question here is what table is this information in? We need the order date. Where do you think the order date table is in? We could check customers. We do have a customer ID field here. We could use that for 13. But does the customer table have the order date in it? No, it does not. It has a phone number, an area code, a zip code. It's got a state, a city, an address, and a first name and a last name, but it doesn't have the order date. So let's go to the orders table. Sure enough, here is the order date in the orders table, and the orders table has a customer ID. So in this table, we have both pieces of information that we're looking for here. So I can come up here to this query, and I can do a select statement. I'll go ahead and, let's see, capitalize it. That's what I was going to do. We want to select the order date. And from which table? In this case, we're going to do the orders table. And we're going to use a where statement because we're kind of filtering, right? We're qualifying. We don't want all the order dates. We just want the order dates where customer ID is 13. So I'm going to type that customer ID is equal to 13. I'm going to put a semicolon there. And I'm going to run this and see if it works. Sure enough, okay, so I've run this query, this SQL query. It looks like there's 36 order dates for customer 13. Who's customer 13? I'm not sure. We could come over here and check. It looks like it's Rachel Patterson. And it looks like if we did a check here, if we filtered using kind of the table filter, is there 36? Yes, there is. There's 36. So that's a good indication that our query here is correct. That that this query gets the data that we want to get. So that's a good sign. So we'll clear that down here in the table. And we'll go back to the query and we'll go back to the SQL view and we are good to go. I'm going to go ahead and click on Control S and save this query. This will be chapter 14, exercise 1A. Sweet. Okay, let's make another query. And we're going to go to, let me make this a little bit smaller so we can still see our tables. This is going to be B. So B says find the order date for all orders placed by the customer with the first name Mark, last name Rosales. Okay, this gets to be a little bit more interesting in some ways because in the orders table we have an order date, but we don't have a customer name. The customer name is in the customers table, The order date is in the orders table. So this is an example where we need to join two tables to get the information that we're looking for. Again, we're looking for the order dates for all orders placed by Mark Rosales. So we're going to start with the select statement, and we're going to do the order date. But from where are we going to get it? This is where we actually have to do an inner join. So we're going to do the orders table. We're going to join the orders table in an inner join with the customers table. How are we going to join them? We're going to join them on the customer ID field because both tables have the customer ID. Orders table has a customer ID and customers has a customer ID. So we know that we can join these tables on that ID. Now that we've joined them, we also need to put in a filter. What are we going to filter? We're going to filter for the first name, right? And the first name and the last name. So we're going to do a customer first name equals Mark, customer last name equals Rosales. And I'm going to check my spelling. That looks good. Single quotes for text in SQL. And let's go ahead and run this guy. See what we get. Okay, so we have a list here of order dates. We actually don't have the customer name, but we have 41. Is that correct? Well, we could check, right? If we knew Mark Rosales' customer ID, which is 24, we could come to the orders table and we could filter for 24. Let's see how many there are. 41. And sure enough, the query is 41. If you look at the order dates here, those look to be exactly the same. So this is a good indication that the SQL is working correctly. Let me go back to the SQL view here. That our inner join is correctly joining these two tables using the same customer ID field. And we're able to filter for the customer first name and last name. I'll go ahead and save this. Chapter 14, exercise 1B. And let's do another one. I'm going to go to Create, Query Design. I'll click on the SQL view, shrink my window down so we can see some tables here. And we're on C. Find the number of orders placed by the customer in Part B. Okay, so we're going to take, very similar to this query here, what we want to do is we just want to count the number of orders. Oops, I minimized it. So this is going to be the very similar query here. I'm going to copy and paste it in from this one. I'm just going to copy and paste. What are we going to change here? All we're going to change is we want to count the number of orders. So we want a total. So instead of selecting every order date, we're going to use a function here called count. And let's say we build an alias or kind of a name for it, number of orders. And that's what this is what's going to appear at the top of the column when we run this query. So we'll go ahead and run the query. And sure enough, there it is. So instead of giving us all of the order dates, it simply counts how many there are, and it puts this name in the top of the column, and 41. That is the number of orders for this customer, Mark Rosales. So we can save this query. This is Chapter 14, Exercise 1C. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let me close a couple of these. Let's create another query. And we'll go to the SQL view, shrink it down in size to fit our window here. And the question here is find the product name for all products supplied by the vendor with vendor ID 3. Okay, so one of the questions we need to ask here is which table are we going to use, right? We have product name, so that's probably going to be the products table. And we have a vendor ID. Let's check if the products table has a vendor ID. Here's Here's product name. We have product name and products. We're also looking for a vendor ID. Is there a vendor ID in this table? I'm looking at the headings. I don't see any. There's nothing here that indicates a vendor ID. So where would that be? Probably in the vendors table. If we look at vendors table, we have a vendor ID. There's a vendor ID. And what's interesting about this table, though, is that we don't have a product ID in this table. How about that? So products and vendors, these two tables actually are not connected, right? There's no common field that I can use to link these two tables. We actually need another table, and that's going to be the product vendors table. So what do we find in the product vendors table? Here we have a table that has a product ID and a vendor ID. So in this case, what we can do is we can actually just use the products table and the product vendors table. We don't even need the vendors table. I know it sounds like a lot. Let me rephrase. We found a vendor ID in the vendors table, but there's also a vendor ID in the product vendors table up here. And what we're looking for in this question, if we go back to the questions, we're looking for product name and a vendor ID. And we're going to be able to find those using just two tables, the products table, the product name, and the product vendors table with the vendor ID. Notice that these two tables have the product ID field in common. So we just need to join these two tables and not worry about the vendors table for now, because the vendor ID is in the product vendors table. Does that make sense? All right, let's try this. So we're going to do similar to what we did before. We're going to select product name, and we're going to join the products table. We'll do an inner join. There are other kind of joins, but we won't work on those today. Product vendors, those are the two names of the table. We're going to join the products table and the product vendors table, these two tables. And how are we going to join them? We're going to join them on the products ID field. So the products table has a product ID. And we're going to set that equal to the product vendors table dot product ID. Notice I use the dot to separate the name of the table from the field in that table. So that makes it very clear that this field in this table is equal to this field in this table. And that becomes the from statement. Finally, we're also going to add a where statement. Why are we going to where it? Because we're looking just for vendor ID 3. We're not looking for all the vendors. We're looking for one vendor. What are the product names for one vendor? And the ID is going to be 3 there. We don't need the tick marks because 3 is not a text. And let's run this, see what happens. Okay, so sure enough, we do get some results. We get 5 product names, but we don't get any vendor ID, right? This is not, that's not what we selected up here. The only one that shows is the product name, even though we're actually performing a filter on the where on the vendor ID field. The vendor ID is not showing up here. If we wanted to add it, we could. We could come up here and say, you know what, I want you to show me the vendor ID as well. Show me the product name and the vendor ID. If we run this, there's the vendor ID. Now we know for sure that we're looking at the products for just vendor ID 3. However, the problem here says, find all of the product names for this vendor. So this looks good. We'll go ahead and leave it like this. We'll leave the vendor ID in the select statement, and we'll do Control S to save this query. This is chapter 14, exercise 1C. Excuse me, 1D. Moving right along. And click OK. Okay, let's do another one. Let's create a new query. and a little bit of window dressing here. Go to the SQL view. We have our tables open. We're ready for number E. Find the product name for all products supplied by the vendor Armadillo brand. Okay, so this takes us to the next level, right? Before we were looking at just a vendor ID. Now we're looking at an actual vendor name, and that is that's gonna necessitate that we join 3 tables for this query. So this should be pretty fun. Let's go ahead and use select product name from. And this is where we're going to join. First, we're going to join the products and the product vendors table because we're looking for the product name and we're looking for the vendor name. So we have to go through the product vendors table using the vendor ID to connect to the vendors table. Right? So we're looking up the product name for only the vendors with a specific name, and we actually have to migrate, not migrate, we have to join the products table with the product vendors table through the product ID so that we can then join the product vendors to the vendors table through the vendor ID to get the vendor name, which is down here, Armadillo brand 10. So that's the goal here. So we're going to join 3 tables. How do you do that? Well, you start with joining 2 tables first. So let's join the products table with the product vendors table on the product ID field. And we know that both of these tables have the product ID field. Then we're going to do another inner join to join the 3rd table, vendors. How are we going to join this 3rd table? This is going to be on the vendor ID field. Isn't that interesting? Okay, let's dig into this statement here. Everything inside the parentheses here is basically a table, okay? It's the table that we're going to join with the vendors. So we've joined 2 tables here. That's going to form, in essence, a single output, right? We're going to take that single output and we're going to join that to the vendors table. And this output and this vendors table have the same vendor ID field, and that's how we're going to join that. So that's how we join 3 tables. And then finally, we want to add the where statement where the vendors, I'll go ahead and keep my capitalization here, name, vend name, which is the name of the field for vendor's name, right? Vend name is equal to, and I'm going to type in the name here, Armadillo brand with single quotes, add my semicolon, and we're going to run that and see what happens. Okay, there we go. So the product names for the Armadillo brand, there's 6. That probably means that the Armadillo brand is not number 3, right? Vendor ID 3 had 5 products. This is saying that Armadillo brand has 6 products. How do we check that? Just to see how we're doing here, we can just manually go back and check, right? We know the vendor ID is 10. We can take the vendor ID of 10 back to the product vendors table. We can filter for 10, and that gives us 6. And then we could take those 6 into the products table, and we could filter by product ID on those 6. Does that make sense? So that would be 22, 25. I'm looking right here. It'd be 30. It'd be 31, 34, and 38. And this is just a very manual process just to see how close we get. Sure enough, the product names here from our query agree with the manual process that we checked. So we went and manually checked what the vendor ID would be in the vendor table and put that in the product vendors table, filtered that here to get the product ID, and then filtered the product ID based on these numbers to get the product names, which showed it right there. All right, we just reversed engineered that entire query. And sure enough, We nailed it. Okay. So how about that? We did it. Hopefully you feel some pride in in getting that far, which is pretty good. That is a pretty good query. So let me go ahead and save this query. Let's see, what was it? Exercise 1E. Great. And then we've got two more here. Let's do another query. And again, we'll do a little bit of window dressing just to make this fit inside of our windows. And this one is find the number of products in each product category. Okay, so if we go to the categories table, it looks like there's 6 different categories of products: accessories, bikes, clothing, components, car racks, and wheels. We want to know how many products are in each of these categories. So let's set that up. We're probably going to need the products table and the categories table. So let's do our select statement. This is just joining 2 tables instead of 3, which is okay. We can do that. We can do 2. Let's do product ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to select product ID, but we want to do a count, right? We want to know how many of those products exist in each category. So the counting here is going to allow us to count the number of products. We're going to do a from statement, and again, we're going to join tables. Here's our syntax for joining tables. Which tables? We're going to join the products table and the categories table. On what field? Well, it turns out that both the products table and the categories table have a common field, which is category ID. And then lastly, we're going to use the group by function. So the group by gives us the ability to group by category. So let's go ahead and do group by category. And we'll see what this looks like. So we've got our code. We'll go ahead and run it. And what does it say? The specified field category ID could refer to more than one table listed in your from clause. Okay, so what it's saying is we need to qualify this category ID in the group by for a specific table. It says, hey, you need to let me know which table you're thinking about using here. And let's go ahead and use the categories table. So I'll type in categories. I'll add the dot. That specifies which category ID I'm using, and we can try to run it now. And sure enough, it comes out. So here's a list of the number of products in each category. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 here, which is good. That's what we'd expect to see. There's 6 categories here. And what we don't know yet is we don't know which category is which. And the EXPR 1000 up here is kind of the default value that Access gives this query because we didn't give it a name. So let's go back and change some of these things. Let's give this a name of number of products. If we don't have spaces, then we don't actually need to use the quotes. We can just type that in. So we've got that. What if we also added the category name, right? Or in this case, it's called the category description, so that we know which category it's in. So I'm going to add that here. I'm going to do category description. Now in this case, because I'm doing category description in the select statement, I'm going to change my group by to category description here in the group by statement. So what we're going to expect to see here is now 2 columns in this table. We'll see the same numbers that we saw before because that was the count. We're going to see a new title for the column, and we hope to see these category descriptions the names next to the numbers so that we can see more easily which category has which number of products. So we're going to run this query, and sure enough, if we expand that out, we see number of products, which is what we created, and we have the category description for each one of these products. Pretty helpful. We could switch this if we wanted to. If we wanted to come back and say, you know, I kind of want this at the beginning. Let's go ahead and put that at this end with a comma here, remove the comma at the end, run this query, and we can put that description here and then the number of products here. And we are good to go. So I can save this query, chapter 14, exercise 1F. And now we have one more query to go. So I'm going to go ahead and create another query. I'm going to go to the SQL view, do a little bit of rearranging of windows, and find the total dollar value of all products in each product category. Okay, so the previous query we found the number of products. This question is what's the total dollar value of all those products? It says the dollar value is retail price times quantity on hand. So apparently this there's a certain quantity of these products. We're going to take that quantity, multiply by the retail price to get the dollar value. And then we're going to group it, just like we did before. So let's look at this. This one, we need additional information, right? We have the categories table, which we need because we're going to group by category, right? There's our by category. What other table do we need? We need a table that has price information and quantity information, right? Let's see if products has that. So products table, sure enough, there's retail price and there's quantity on hand. These are the two fields that we need. So it looks like we just need to join two tables. So let's try that. Let's see where we go. We're going to select. Let's go ahead and do category description. And we're going to take the retail price times quantity on hand. And let's give that a name, dollar value. How's that? Make it a little bit descriptive, maybe. What are we going to do that from? We're going to take that from a join, two tables. So we have our products table. We're going to interjoin that with our categories table. How are we going to join that on? Well, both the products table and the categories table has a category ID field. So we're going to use those same fields as the joining field. Products.category ID equals categories dot category ID. Does that make sense? And then finally, we're going to group by that again. We're going to do the category description so we can try that. Okay, let's run this query, see how we go. So again, we're selecting the description, which is the name of the category, and we're doing a calculation right here in the SQL statement. We're going to multiply the retail price times the quantity. Oh, I have an error here on my name. This is quantity on hand. So I'm going to retype that, right? Quantity on hand, quantity on hand. We're going to create a name for that called dollar value. That's going to be in the top of the column. We're going to join the products and the categories table using the category ID. And then we're going to group all this by category description. So let's run and see what happens. Okay, we have a error. Your query does not include the specified expression as part of an aggregate function. Okay, what is this telling us? This is saying when we use the group by, we have to put this part of the select statement inside of an aggregate function. So let's think about that for a second. What are we forgetting? Here we're asking to group by category, but this is saying calculate the dollar value for every product, right? So what we're doing is we're not including this part right here inside of an aggregate function. What we really want to do is we want to sum this. So we're going to add a sum function to this statement because we want a sum for every category, right? That's the one part here that we forgot. So we're going to put the sum around the calculation, and we're going to name that sum as dollar value. And let's try to run it again. Okay, we have some results now. We should see the 6 lines. Sure enough, there's the 6 lines. There's this category description. This is the summed value of the total dollar value for all the products in the accessories category, which is 22,000. 33,000 of bikes. Wow, accessories sounds like a lot. So does components. Um, but that is what we're looking for. So if we go back again to the SQL view, we're selecting the description. We're creating a dollar value column, which is in the sum function. And we're joining that to those two tables, products and categories table, using the category ID field. And then we're grouping that, which means we want to see just the categories. We want to group by categories. And that's what we've got here. Great, so I can save this query, chapter 14, exercise 1G, and we are good to go. This concludes the video for the problems for exercise number 1.